Hello, everybody. Jonathan Rothschild. We are preparing for our fifth and final speaker in this year's Pitt Family Foundation Speaker Series. We're letting people into the room. It takes a few minutes to get people in, so we'll probably give it another minute or so before we start. Then we have a very special guest tonight who's doing us a great favor, and you'll hear more about that. Let me speak for a minute about the series itself. This is our final speaker in our second year. We're already beginning to plan for next year, and we hope to bring speakers to Tucson for live events, as well as mix in some online speakers. That's really worked well for us. I want to thank all of you who are joining us tonight for your participation over the last 2 years. We've had close to 3,000 attendees over the 10 speaker sessions, and we're grateful for your interest. If you have suggestions for speakers or comments regarding the series, or interested in offering support to expand the series, Bernadette Wilkinson will put her email in the chat box in the course of the evening, and you can send your comments, suggestions, or willingness to help to Bernadette, and we will take those into consideration or be in touch with you. And there I see on the screen, bwilkins@arizona.edu. This series was initiated to talk about extreme partisanship and polarization, its causes and solutions. And certainly we've had an all-star group of speakers, from Ezra Klein to Eddie Glaude to Jill Lepore to Liliana Mason to Lawrence Leslie and others. And tonight's speaker is right there with them. Finally, I do want to thank the Pitt Family Foundation for making this work possible, and look forward to continuing our work with the foundation and others to advance this work. The format tonight will be similar to what we've done in the past. Our guest will speak, and you'll be able to put questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get as many questions answered as we can. Our speaker tonight, Mark will introduce, but I'll leave it at this and let Mark take it from there. He's currently in Hungary. It is 2:30 in the morning, and so you can imagine the appreciation we have for him being with us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the Dean of the Law School, Dean Mark Müller, who has been an integral part of developing and supporting this speaker series. Dean Müller will introduce tonight's speaker. Dean Müller.
Jonathan, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us now and across this series, both this year and the year before. Thank you to the Pitt Family Foundation, which has made this possible. The high level of interest and the critical issues the series addresses makes me very happy indeed that we will continue next year. Given where Professor Müller is, I should say to everyone who is local, good evening, and to him, a very early good morning. The fact that today's speaker joins us from Eastern Europe, 9 hours away, is a footnote to the global nature of his work and his ability to chronicle and interpret these extraordinary political times. Jan-Werner Müller is the Roger Williams Straus Professor of Politics at Princeton and the founding director of its project in the history of political thought. His work consistently earns acclaim on the international stage by examining the ways that democracies around the world fail or flourish. A great part of that analysis involves looking at how individuals relate to and connect with their governing systems through political parties, the media, identity groups, and the rules of political infrastructure. In his 2021 book, Democracy Rules, Professor Müller outlines the attributes of democratic governance and examines how democracy can be abused in the pursuit of getting and maintaining power. In his previous books, What is Populism and Contesting Democracy, Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe, Professor Müller diagnoses the health and vitality of democratic governments and goes further, providing concrete suggestions about how they could be revitalized and restored. Professor Müller has taught at Princeton since 2005. He's a frequent speaker in the US and around the world. His work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, New York Times, Project Syndicate, and elsewhere. Before joining Princeton, he was a fellow of modern European thought at St. Antony's College and All Souls College in Oxford, studied at the Free University in Berlin, University College in London, St. Antony's College, and Princeton. With that, please extend a warm welcome to Professor Jan-Werner Müller.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the very kind introduction. Thank you in general for having me in this speaker series. So as you all know, we've now had quite a number of years of an intense discussion about the so-called crisis of democracy. A discussion which you might say in itself has become increasingly polarized and which has divided observers among, to put it crudely, but I think not inaccurately, those who on the whole tend to put the blame for a possible crisis on the people themselves. So in the last couple of years, but especially of course since 2016, it's become possible to talk about so-called ordinary citizens, as if there really were any others, in a way that I think one wouldn't have really done for a long time in polite society. People are very comfortable talking about people being irrational, always being ready to be seduced by the great demagogue, lots and lots of things which seem to come straight out of the sort of mass psychology of the late 19th century when the masses were generally deemed irrational, etc. On the other hand, though, as also everybody knows, there's a position that says, no, don't blame the people, of course. Blame so-called elites. Blame them for a kind of globalization that has gone wrong, that hasn't benefited as many folks as was initially promised. They are the ones who are ultimately to be held accountable for this crisis. Now, as different as these two positions are, of course, you might say they actually have one thing in common. They are both about groups of people, be it the many or be it the few. And I'm not saying that thinking about the many or the few is in any sense fundamentally misguided, but it does lead us, it seems to me, neglect a different aspect, one that has gotten relatively short shrift in recent years, and that is basically a focus on institutions, and in particular a focus on what I would like to call in my contribution today, the infrastructure, or maybe even more poignantly, the critical infrastructure of democracy. Now, as you also all know, infrastructure has become very fashionable. Nobody's ever sort of officially against infrastructure. It's one of the last things for which you can even garner bipartisan support in the United States. In general, nobody's against fixing potholes or, for that matter, preventing bridges from collapsing. But why or how might this apply to democracy more broadly? Well, when you think about it, infrastructure on one level is all about reaching other people and being reached by them. Think about highways, train tracks, even something like the post office, which of course, as also everybody knows, has become highly politicized in certain ways in recent years. More particularly, an infrastructure of democracy involves organizations that allows people precisely to reach others and be reached by them in more effective ways. What do I mean concretely? What I mean concretely is that a well-functioning political infrastructure allows citizens to use their basic political rights, and in particular, their basic, if you like, communicative freedoms in a democracy, by which I mean free speech, free association, free assembly, in more effective ways. In theory, I can demonstrate out there all by myself, or I can, keep writing op-eds which end up in the spam folder of all my friends or family. But if there are organizations out there which can, so to speak, multiply our voices, it makes a difference for how effective that use of basic rights might be. All of which is a very long-winded way of saying something, which actually was kind of known ever since the 19th century. What I'm referring to is the idea that representative democracies, as we know them, really only work with effective political parties and with effective professional news media organizations. And many of you will remember that already Alexis de Tocqueville, in his famous observations about democracy in America in the 19th century, hones in on precisely these two institutions and says what is so striking for him as a French aristocrat traveling around the United States is how strong parties are, and how also in those days they're often very strongly connected to newspapers, which one might or might not think is a good thing. But for him, these were both essential ingredients in making democracy work. And I think, at the risk of sounding overly conservative in certain ways, I think this is all still true today, which is not to say it could never change, which is not to say that other organizations don't matter. So what I'm about to expand on does not imply that, let's say, trade unions don't matter or other civil society organizations don't matter, but there is still something very special about political parties and about professional news media organizations. And above all, I'm not telling you anything very, very strikingly new here, both of these institutions are also very often said to be in crisis. Actually, here maybe even crisis in the original Greek meaning of that term, namely something that denotes a kind of life and death moment. Many of you will remember that crisis initially came out of medical context, when it's basically the moment when it's decided whether the patient will live or the patient will die. And when you think especially about local journalism in the United States, one might be tempted to say, well, in many cases, the patient has already died, with, the great sort of death of especially local newspapers around the country. So my suggestion to you is that we could make some headway in thinking about the crisis of democracy, or at least challenges to democracy today, if we paid more attention to basically this infrastructure, which also really is, you might say, like physical infrastructure in many parts of the country, in a state of disrepair. But to diagnose this, and then maybe also to turn to some more positive prescriptions, of course, we need to be clearer on what exactly we expect from such a political democratic infrastructure. We kind of know what we want from roads, kind of know what we want from many other aspects of physical infrastructure, but what does it really mean for political parties and professional news organizations to function well? This will be the gist of my remarks tonight. In the first chapter, I want to remind us about two core functions of these institutions. I will then, in the second chapter, move on to specifying criteria for basically judging whether these institutions are in good shape or not. And then lastly, if time permits, I'll also say at least a couple of words about one of the most hotly contested, debated institutions sort of in the wider world of media. And you won't be surprised to hear that that is, of course, the rise and impact of social media in particular. But allow me to open my first chapter and just very broadly remind ourselves of two core functions of what you might broadly call intermediary institutions that help citizens to connect to each other and that also help them to connect to the political system. One of them goes contrary to what one quite often also nowadays reads and hears when it comes to democracy. Very often, observers today say, well, look, our problem really is that we are so divided. Our problem is that, we lack civility. Our problem is that, people hate each other, especially, but not only in the United States. And that if only we could overcome our differences, reconcile our conflicts, and so on, then somehow we would be back on the right track. I would respectfully differ from that kind of, in my view, very often more or less kitschy communitarian talk. Democracy is about conflict. There's nothing wrong with having conflict in a democracy. In a certain way, the whole point of democracy is to enable us to deal with conflict in more or less peaceful ways. And more particularly, in a certain way, the very job of political parties, but to some degree also of professional news organizations, is to set up, to start conflicts, to suggest to people what different, let's say, interests, but also different ideas, ideologies, if you like, or identities actually look like, and how one could basically engage in certain political struggles around them. Because none of this is somehow objectively given or self-evident. To use a historical example, yes, workers kind of already know that they're workers, but it takes a kind of socialist party to explain to them that they're also part of a larger working class, which, you know, might have structurally different interests from employers, from capitalists, from others, and that therefore, according to parties which kind of structure conflicts, they should push their interests in a particular way, understand themselves in a particular way, and so on. All of this actually would have been completely conventional wisdom to, for instance, mid-20th century political scientists who would have said, yeah, of course it's about conflict. There's nothing wrong with that. And conflicts can always be set up in different ways. The real question is whether we are setting up conflicts in ways that is ultimately productive, or at the very least, that makes conflicts compatible with the maintenance of democracy over time. And here is really where the problems start. For shorthand, I'll just flag two ways in which conflicts can be set up the wrong way, or in such a way that basically clashing interests, or also for that matter, clashing identities, play out in such a way that democracy itself might be endangered. So let me just flag these two very quickly. First of all, whatever you do as you struggle against your political adversaries, I think what you can't do is to basically systematically deny their standing in the democracy, to basically on one level suggest that they don't really have a place in our democracy to begin with, that they are not, you know, fully recognizable citizens or parties or anything of that sort. This is basically what I believe so-called right-wing populists in particular always tend to do. They always tend to suggest in one form or another that those who oppose them don't truly belong to the polity at all. And you may recall that very often, not always, but very often, for instance, former President Trump would react to certain types of criticism, not by way of defending policies, which I think is what any sort of normal democratic government would tend to do. You know, we are elected, here's why we're doing this. This is why the critics, you know, of course, are allowed to speak, but they basically are wrong. No, the answer very often was simply to suggest that somehow criticism was in and of itself un-American. And that's the kind of thing which on a certain level makes conflict incompatible with democracy. Because if you no longer recognize the others as, you know, having proper standing to be part of a conflict, then in a certain way, you can't also expect that, you know, those who kind of engage in this conflict will ultimately accept that they win or lose and continue to buy into the system as a whole. And furthermore, the other sort of precondition for conflict to work in a democracy, to be compatible with democracy, is that, and here's a moment where, you know, especially if journalists in the audience, if there are journalists in the audience, you know, we might hear some hearty laughter if we could hear it. The other precondition is that basically you respect a minimum set of facts, which is not to say that, you know, everybody has to agree on what facts mean. It's not to suggest that, you know, facts ever speak for themselves. None of us has ever heard the facts speak, as far as I can tell. But if you're in a situation where from the get-go, the other side, for instance, denies that, you know, the issue that you want to have a conflict about even exists, then it's also very hard to see how on one level you could remain partners in conflict and partners in a democracy where you can fight each other, but also ultimately also sort of come together again in a shared project. So To use a by now fairly cliched example, if your opponent simply denies that there's anything going on with climate, that this is entirely made up, that there's nothing to talk about, that it's impossible to really have any disagreement about this because the problem doesn't exist as such, then it's very hard to see how this can become a conflict that is ultimately compatible with maintaining a well-functioning democracy. So long story short, what I'm suggesting to you is that one of the core functions of institutions of the critical infrastructure of democracy is actually to engage in conflict, but not any old conflict, but conflict, so to speak, done the right way. And this, by the way, I think is also true of professional news organizations. I know that very many people are worried about, these organizations becoming partisan themselves. As far as I'm concerned, there is nothing wrong with, for instance, a media organization itself saying, look, here's a neglected issue, here's a certain campaign that we want to start around questions that we think haven't been considered strongly enough. This used to happen all the time in previous eras, that, for instance, newspapers themselves took a certain stance, brought up certain issues. Again, the question is not whether they do it, but how they do it, and whether they do it in a way that ultimately is compatible with democracy. The second core function of these institutions that I want to remind ourselves of has something to do with pluralism. Pluralism both in an external sense and an internal sense. What do I mean? Well, the external part should be fairly obvious. Of course, in a democracy, you need a plurality of political parties. No democracy can be a one-party state. And the same is, broadly speaking, true of professional news organizations / media organizations, where, of course, you want a plurality of what is on offer. What is less obvious is the importance of internal pluralism and something like an internal democracy, for instance, within political parties. It's less obvious because many people would say, look, people join political parties or they engage in political parties because they want to be partisans and they want to basically push certain political principles. They don't want to have endless debates and endless pluralism around all kinds of questions. This is why famously or infamously Oscar Wilde said, the problem with socialism was that it took too many evenings. In other words, if you have all this sort of internal pluralism in political parties, it attracts the kind of folks, who enjoy sitting around all night, debating abstract principles, never really deciding anything, sort of, as some of our colleagues in political science have pointed out, sort of people who treat politics as a kind of hobby where it's sort of fun to talk about stuff, but nothing is ever really sort of pushed or accomplished. That's fair enough as a worry, but I would suggest to you that an absence of any kind of internal pluralism has serious costs for democracy as a whole. Because if you have political parties which internally are also run in a, let's say, fairly authoritarian way, or which ultimately become something like a personality cult structured around one particular leader, no guesses no prizes for guessing who I might possibly be thinking of in an American context, then what disappears is also the possibility of something like a legitimate opposition or critical loyalty within a political party. Because after all, even if partisans agree broadly on principles, these principles never apply themselves. As the Democrats, for instance, found out to their cost, you might say, well, you can be generally in favor of a certain type of healthcare, but what this means in practice can be very heavily contested and needs to be talked about and needs to be puzzled out in certain ways. So there is always room for debate. Problem is, if you don't have debate, if parties become a sort of, to coin a phrase, a kind of OnlyFans organization, where basically it's all about agreeing with the leader, then I think this has costs for democracy as a whole. Or, if I may to spell it out more concretely, the fact that Trump kind of, in a sense, transformed the Republican Party into something that on the inside started to look much more authoritarian. As you all know, it's become very, very difficult for people to say, I'm a Republican in good standing, and at the same time, I happen to be a critic of Trump. Then you are pushed down the Liz Cheney route in American politics. That has costs as for democracy as a whole, because then there is also no restraining force within a political party. So to put it again very bluntly, if I may, there's a kind of line from this transformation of a political party towards January 6th, because there are no restraining forces really left. There's no real sort of internal process and procedure left there to basically make sure that parties are also internally democratic. And I would generalize this point to the extent that if you look around the world today and you look more closely at more or less authoritarian right-wing populist leaders in various countries, be it India, be it Hungary, be it Turkey, but you can also sort of say the same things about these types of figures on the left. So just think about Venezuela as an obvious example. It's not an accident that all these leaders keep a completely tight grip on their own political parties, that there is no real space for internal dissent or for anything like legitimate opposition that is still recognized by these types of leaders. So this is why, long story short, internal pluralism matters as well. And this is why the disappearance of internal pluralism is a kind of alarm sign in a democracy. Okay, let me swiftly move on to my last chapter, which I promised you was going to be about more concrete criteria to judge the health of these elements of a critical infrastructure of democracy. I just want to highlight three in particular. First of all, it matters that these types of institutions are, broadly speaking, accessible, so that citizens feel they are supplied with the right kinds of institutions, but also that they have methods, ways of getting engaged with and in them. And here's an instance where you might say, actually, social media, for all the complaints we always hear about them, of course, on one level have an enormous advantage, as everybody knows. It's very easy to get engaged. It's very easy to basically gain access to the public sphere and become parts of debates. It's also, interestingly enough, not quite true that social media are necessarily characterized by a complete absence of pluralism. This is something that you will remember, especially after 2016, everybody kept saying that the problem was filter bubbles, echo chambers, and so on. People basically get confirmed what they already believe all the time. I'm not saying that this phenomenon doesn't exist, but we now empirically know one or two things that we didn't know in 2016. And one of the interesting outcomes of more careful empirical work has basically been that these phenomena have probably been exaggerated, that in many, many ways, actually, our online lives might be significantly more diverse than our offline lives. This is, of course, in and of itself, not necessarily meaningful for or against democracy, because you can easily imagine, or maybe you can think of personal examples where, yes, I'm exposed to a lot of diversity online because I love to be outraged by what some people are saying and doing. Still, by now, I think it's a fairly firm conclusion that actually we used to have what one of my colleagues sort of with a tad of irony calls an echo chamber about echo chambers, where we all told each other the story about, oh yeah, the issue is filter bubbles. We're all sort of in the same homogeneous groups. And this is empirically simply not quite as true as some people tended to think. So whatever the problem is, it's not accessibility, and it's not necessarily this kind of internal homogeneity. Second criterion that I think is very important, maybe less so in the United States, but in other democracies, is that these elements, these institutions of the critical infrastructure of democracy have to be autonomous, which is to say that political parties really have to be parties, and news organizations really have to be about reporting the news and not about something else. I flag this because in many countries, such organizations, such institutions, can easily be identified as de facto the instrument of figures who we may well call oligarchs. So this is not true just in Russia. If you look at, for instance, who owns the largest media organizations in France, it's very worrying how concentrated power has become. If you think back to somebody like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy in the 90s and beyond, I think it's not unkind to point out that sort of his political party was basically just a kind of tool or instrument for an entrepreneur to further his particular interests, also to protect himself from the judges, who were always after him for various forms of possible criminality. That's something important, that you can be really sure that a party is a party and not a nefarious instrument for something else, and that you can be sure that a news organization really is devoted to reporting the news and not really about something else. So autonomy matters too. And then lastly, it's also very important that these kinds of institutions are what the distinguished British philosopher Honora O'Neill has called accessible, by which she means not just accessible, but more particularly that citizens who look at these institutions can sort of figure out by themselves what they're about, and whether they really live up to the claims they make about themselves. Now, a large chunk of that, as always in life, is of course about financial transparency. So you want to be able to understand, how political parties are financed. You want to know how, for instance, a private media company is really financed. Whether there could be forces influencing them that remain hidden in one way or the other. But you also, in a sense, want to make sure that there are institutions more broadly that also allow citizens to kind of understand what are, of course, sometimes very complex, let's say, financial figures in such a way that they can make up their own minds about them. And as you all know, this has given rise to various organizations, such as, for instance, Transparency International in the world of business, that are devoted to precisely this task and to basically allow people to assess certain institutions and sort of get a sense of what they are really about, what their internal life looks like, and in particular, finally, also what their financing looks like in the end. In the 1 remaining minute, let me once and for all clear up all remaining questions about the tiny question of social media. No, of course I can't, but I'm happy to come back to this in the questions and answers if you like. But let me just, as probably has already become obvious, let me tone down what we nowadays so often hear as this incredibly apocalyptic talk about social media. The very fact that we've moved from one extreme. I mean, some of us might be old enough to remember a time when we were told that, Twitter was a liberation technology, that, Facebook was going to be behind democratic revolutions everywhere. I'm thinking, of course, particularly about the Arab Spring, about a good 13 years ago. The fact that we've moved from that extreme to the extreme of people saying that, Facebook is basically fascism, our democracies are bound to fail because of social media, I think is an indication of the fact that we really lack proper criteria to make sense of this phenomenon, that we're kind of at sea when it comes to judging it. And that also very often, unfortunately, we kind of default into something that very often is sort of the easy way out when we have to confront new and complex developments. Namely, we imagine a kind of golden age when supposedly, everything was so much better. But of course, usually there is no golden age. And again, we already sort of alluded a little bit to what things were like in the 19th century in the United States, but also elsewhere. This was no golden age for factual reporting or non-partisanship or anything of that sort. Newspapers were lying all the time; they were stealing all the time. It's very hard to make a claim that as the further you go back in the past, the better it would have been in this regard. So my suggestion to you is really to kind of deploy more carefully precise criteria such as accessibility, autonomy, and pluralism, among other things, to kind of look at these institutions more carefully, and then ideally also come up with more positive prescriptions, some of which by now, of course, are incredibly well known and not exactly sort of shocking news anymore. So many people are now willing to say, yeah, maybe social media companies are concentrating too much power. We do need to break them up. It's not that they necessarily are that manipulative in the way that sometimes it is suggested, but as always, the mere concentration of power in and of itself can be a threat to democracy, because what if they change their mind? What if, all of a sudden they do try to influence things in a more systematic way? So that's, a sort of fairly obvious push for pluralism. Same is true, of course, for demands for transparency, as many people have pointed out rightly. These the algorithms at the heart of these companies, of course, are complete black boxes, including for social scientists. as one of my colleagues from Stanford at one point put it, we don't even know what we don't know because it's so mysterious. And as social scientists, we can't even ask the right questions because we have so little access to what is really going on and how things are really structured. So long story short, I think it's important to go down this more constructive and in a sense also more precise path of looking at this at this new element of our critical infrastructure of democracy and sees this sort of often apocalyptic and de facto, alas, also somewhat defeatist talk about social media, which always ends up with a position that says, well, look, this is something that democracy somehow can cope with, or even worse, and here the circle of my lecture closes, or it sort of gives license to precisely those people who tend to blame the people themselves for all of democracy's ills, who incessantly talk about internet mobs and say, oh, the issue is, of course, that social media has shown us again how damn irrational people are, how willing they are to believe in conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that that's a terribly helpful thing to do. So I'll leave it with that, and I'll look forward to our discussion.
See if I think I'm here now. All right, we've got some great questions in the Q&A, and I'm just going to take it from the top. Professor, you are being called. What early warning signs of the current threats to democracy and extreme polarization might we have seen, identified, and acted upon had we been more attuned to the problem?
We have 5 hours left, right, to answer this simple and straightforward. But of course, so as usual, it's a very good question. That's another way of saying it's a very difficult question. So I would highlight 2 things, and forgive me if this might not come out as entirely fair and balanced in terms of which kinds of actors I'm particularly pointing at. So personally, I'm skeptical of the view that basically, everything was fine. Let's say, in particular, that the ship of state of the Republican Party was kind of smoothly sailing on the sea of democracy, and then this crazy pirate called Donald Trump comes on board and basically hijacks the vessel and steers it into the choppy waters of, call it what you wish, populism, authoritarianism, and so on. I think there's a backstory here that does involve some early warning signs, which is not to say that all along the Republican Party was going to go into an authoritarian direction. It's not what I'm saying. But if you think back, for instance, to the way that Newt Gingrich started talking in the 90s, he was doing exactly the kind of thing that I was alluding to a few minutes ago. You may remember that he even handed out this sheet of specific terms that Republicans were supposed to use when they talked about Democrats. And a lot of these terms, you won't be surprised to hear, you may remember, were not exactly very nice. And they precisely came down to saying, look, these are sort of potential traitors, basically un-American, not people who have sort of, are on the same page as sort of, partners in a conflict in a democracy. But really something that looks more like an enemy, not a legitimate adversary, but an enemy who ideally is kind of removed from the political world entirely. And that is just not democracy compatible. And I just add that this is not the same point as the one that people often make about civility. I don't think there's any problem if you attack your opponents very strongly. If you say that their policies are totally misguided, that's all fine. It's not about, we all have to agree. That's not what democracy is about. But if you basically suggest that, ideally the other side is totally eliminated, then I think, we're getting into dangerous waters. And that didn't start yesterday. The other more structural issue I would highlight, alas, also has something to do more with the right side of the spectrum. As in particular, a number of social scientists who revisited the 2016 election, and actually in a fantastic piece of social science that is freely accessible on the web called Network Propaganda, have shown the sort of tendency after 2016 to say, oh, it was the Russians or it was Facebook, somehow didn't take note of the fact that for a long time already, basically our, broadly speaking, media system has been very asymmetrical, which is to say there is a kind of self-enclosed right-wing media ecology where news, quote unquote, is not really about any facts. It's really about political self-validation. That's not to say that, on the left, we only have facts and everybody is perfectly rational and so on. Not at all. The point is that when you have, let's say, crazy conspiracy theory on the left, which also happens, of course, eventually people who might hear about it encounter publications such as the New York Times or watch CNN or something, which basically tells them, look, this is nonsense. This is not true. People in this self-enclosed right-wing media world would not even encounter, let's say, the Wall Street Journal online, which also sooner or later, because the factual reporting is very reliable, it's going to suggest to people, look, certain things are simply not true. The point is that this self-enclosed world is not a result of the internet. It's not a kind of inevitable result of technological change. It emerged already much earlier on the basis of fundamental regulatory changes, so the end of the fairness doctrine in the 1980s, the way that cable was set up, the way that talk radio became available in certain ways. I mean, we tend to forget that the medium with which most Americans still spend most time is radio. So these so-called old media still matter a great deal, and less obviously, the way that things started to change in the 1980s sort of created a particular structure where then in a certain way the internet came on top. So hence also we see different outcomes in different countries, because not every country sort of made the same regulatory decisions that were made in the United States in the 80s and 90s. So yes, you also have crazy conspiracy theories in other countries. You also have, you God forbid, you even have QAnon in other countries. You have, all kinds of stuff which also, would ring alarm bells. But the fact that it's so powerful in the United States and that it basically creates a real structural challenge for democracy itself, that predates more recent technological innovations. And that's something that one could have, I think, also seen more clearly earlier on. Of course, the $64,000 question is what to do about it. But these would be my sort of two broader answers as to what actually, has been going on for quite some time already. And that especially in retrospect, to make us think that, we should have paid attention to this already a long time ago.
Next question, good answer. Next question. This is a teacher, and a teacher will be asking, how does one educate students into a receptivity to an appreciation of conflict rather than, say, a yearning for authority, and to recognize the crucial difference between an argument and a fight? How do we get there on an individual basis?
Yeah, that's an excellent and again very difficult question. I think again there's a structural element to this. I think it's fair to say that there are two larger developments which have been problematic in the US, but not only the US in this regard. The first one is simply that I think it's broadly true that civic education in general has been squeezed more and more because of the incessant sort of talk about we must do more STEM, we have to face up to the challenge from China. We can't spend all that time on these sort of soft, fluffy, nice democracy, kind of things, and especially kind of learning the skills of how to disagree in a certain way. That takes a lot of time. That's not like, here's the manual, you read it, then you do the multiple choice test, and then you got it. So it's a time intensive thing to begin with. And basically there's been less and less time for it because, many who determine what gets done in schools have concluded that no, other things should take priority. So this in and of itself, I think is a challenge, how to make time for it. The second challenge is, I think, although that's maybe now more at the university level than maybe necessarily the school level, that of course people have also become very, very afraid in conditions of polarization. And they think, look, we go close to this, my classroom is going to explode. And we don't necessarily all, come automatically equipped with the pedagogical skills to deal with these situations. So this has led, again, especially at the university level, I think, to a somewhat unfortunate tendency to say, let's do something, but let's do something that's safer. And what's safer? Well, in many instances, things like community service is safer. That still gets you engaged, and you do something meaningful for the local community. And God forbid, I'm not against that, of course. Many people are doing very, very worthwhile things, but in a strange roundabout way, it's also a way of avoiding politics. There's a book that some of you may have seen by the president of Johns Hopkins called "What Universities Owe to Democracy," which makes this point with data very strongly and says, look, I'm not against community service, not at all. Very important to have outreach and to connect universities, especially to local surroundings, but that can come at the expense of students learning to address political questions more directly. And I think then the more concrete answer to the question is that you need time. You need to sort of structure a classroom also such that people feel like, okay, they can sort of try things out a little bit of how they talk to each other. There are also clear boundaries, and these will also be made clear by a teacher who has the required skill set to basically say, yes, it's okay to disagree, but there's certain boundaries. And I was for better or for worse, trying to suggest some of these boundaries in my talk. So if you basically start to deny the standing of the other side entirely, or if you really go off in a direction which loses any connection to certain facts, then these are moments when I think you can gently intervene and sort of make clear that this is not the right way of doing it, and still you can have fundamentally opposed opinions. I mean, again, at the risk of saying the obvious, just because we have facts in common does not mean we have opinions in common. And you can still have, let's say, vastly different views about what should be done about climate, even if you agree on the urgency of the problem. So this is what I would very broadly suggest, that you take the time to the extent that it's at all possible, which sometimes also means you have to make the case to higher ups to say, we need more time for this. This is a time-intensive, labor-intensive kind of undertaking, but there's a reason why, as many folks will remember, someone like John Dewey said, look, the school is really the place, the site where democracy gets going, and where citizens learn to be citizens in a certain kind of way, and we need to make time for it, and we need to also then train teachers to have the requisite skills. Of course, they are also incredibly squeezed and surveilled and tested. They themselves, of course, are always tested now in ways which will make them think that, okay, I better get my other scores right, because math is obviously more important. And again, unfortunately, civic education becomes kind of sidelined. So this would be my, I realize, fairly general, but hopefully not entirely trivial answer.
All right. Next question about the political parties. Does the two-party system of U.S. politics hold particular problems for decreasing pluralism within parties? If you only have two parties, it's so much easier to identify the other party is the main problem, and then internal dissension can be outweighed by external differences. And sort of to add to that, how do you assure within a party, or how can you develop within a party more internal pluralism?
Yeah, so again, both very good, i.e. difficult questions. On the first one, it's maybe worth reminding ourselves that for really a long time, political scientists would have told a story that looked very, very different. And it was sort of conventional wisdom to say, look, these multi-party systems with proportional representation systems, they have all these extremists, but thank God this could never happen here, because the two-party system was understood as more or less a guarantee for a certain type of moderation. Because yes, if you may have had extremist views, but to get anywhere, of course, you basically had to enter some kind of big tent and convince all kinds of other people that this was sort of broadly fitting into a platform that could appeal to a large variety of citizens. So that to me is an indication that no, it's never just one factor. I mean, this is unfortunately sometimes the tendency also among alas political scientists to say, oh, if we only change this one thing, then democracy will be secured and saved and so on. But of course, there is no panacea, and we always are condemned to take a more holistic view and say, yeah, well, party system is one thing, but it's going to interact with so many other with so many other factors, including the election system, including the media system, including the general setup of political institutions, such that usually it's very implausible to say, oh, if only this one thing were somehow different. The particular challenge, though, is that we really are in a very paradoxical situation where we have obviously very, very high levels of polarization and partisanship, and at the same time, weak parties. One, would have sort of thought commonsensically that if you have strong partisanship, that also actually means you have strong parties. But it's actually the opposite. You precisely have very hollowed out parties, which don't really have very effective internal checks on what kind of platforms are formulated, how they are formulated, what kind of candidates get chosen. And again, this has been, has been a long-standing development. Unfortunately, it's become easier to basically be your own political entrepreneur of sorts, to just use the party as a kind of tool, as opposed to facing the requirement of engaging, for instance, in a kind of back and forth debate to make sure that while we disagree on the application of principles, we are all on board with principles which are ultimately clearly pro-democratic. And that in turn, yet again, is much more about structural factors. And I won't surprise anybody in this conversation if I point to the usual suspects, such as campaign finance, gerrymandering. I mean, these all, in a sense, facilitate situations where, in a sense, it's become much easier to sort of do your own thing as a political entrepreneur and not really live up to any standards of sort of internal democratic engagement within parties. Now, this is not impossible. This is not impossible to address. Again, other countries have laws about how parties are structured internally, which, to be sure, sometimes are seen in common law countries as sort of overly intrusive, as overly interfering with the basic right to political association. But you can you can find a middle ground between incredibly detailed regulations, such as is the case in Germany, where the state basically prescribes how often you have to have certain meetings and so on. I think that's too much. That's something that should be left to people themselves. But plenty of other prescriptions about meeting a basic standard of internal democracy is something that one could reasonably agree on. Problem is, of course, as in so many of these issues, since ultimately political parties themselves are involved in making these decisions, we are faced with actors who don't exactly have incentives to make these sorts of decisions, because they are bound to the system as it is. And we can daydream, if you like, and think of countries which occasionally at least have managed to sort of take things out of the hands of political parties, have used assemblies of randomly chosen citizens to decide questions such as the size of parliament or also campaign finance, where it was very clear that if parties themselves decide these issues, they're going to decide in their own favor and just reinforce the system as it is. But again, that's a sort of chicken and egg thing, because then we simply are pushing the problem one step further away, because then usually the usual response, well, then how do we get to citizen assemblies, as they have happened in British Columbia, France, Iceland, a number of other countries, Ireland, how do we get to that? The usual sort of hand wavy answer at some point then becomes, well, large scale social mobilization. Well, nobody's ever against large scale social mobilization, but it's also not exactly a very concrete answer to the question. And I'm sorry if my general answer also wasn't very concrete, but I hope it was interesting anyway.
All right. Well, I'm going to put these two questions together because I think they do fit. What is the way forward with regard to institutions like the media, the courts, and the parties in places like Hungary, where you are now, or Russia? Is the U.S. trending there in slow motion? And I'll add to the question that really adds to that. So cutting to what we're all wondering, how much danger is U.S. democracy in right now? But maybe that's done well by comparing to Hungary and Russia and other places.
Yeah, so let me say two things. One is that we really are in uncharted waters. So as you know, there was a great wave of democratization in the 70s, 80s, to some degree also still in the 1990s. And obviously all countries are different, and we should resist facile generalizations. But there was a certain kind of playbook how you basically have peaceful transitions to democracy. Then we've been faced with what now many of our colleagues call democratic recession, which is no longer really up for debate. I mean, it's empirically a settled matter that for many years now we have a trend that goes in the other direction, but we don't really have anything that looks like very concrete strategies of how you get back to democracy if you are faced with actors who, of course, are not officially saying they're against democracy. I mean, this is the sort of the particular thing about our time, that nobody in Hungary or even in Russia, or for that matter, even in China, says we're officially against democracy. I mean, it was a very striking moment when, in advance of Biden's summit for democracy in December, basically Beijing came out with these long papers explaining why their approach to democracy was actually superior. So we're not so obviously looking at, oh, here are obviously the official dictators and autocrats, and here are the Democrats. Now, that in itself is not a reason not to try certain strategies, but it, in a sense, by itself complicates the picture. And what's also complicates the picture is that a lot of these autocrats, including in the country in which I'm right now, have been very good at doing things in very legalistic ways. So they've set up structures that, to the innocent observer can look, they're still fairly democratic. There's sort of no, obvious sort of, God forbid, it's not like Russia in the sense of, look, if you protest against the government, now you will be locked up. It looks much more innocent, and yet systems have been constructed in very clever ways, such that turnover of power is very difficult. And less obviously, even if opposition parties win, there are many things built into the system such that they cannot effectively exercise power, even if they have majorities. And that requires incredibly fine-grained approaches in terms of bringing about change, sometimes including constitutional change, such that you do not give ammunition to those who then say, oh, look, first these guys are doing it, and now the other guys are doing it as well. So I know this is not, I know this is the answer that every professor always gives, which is, oh, it's so complex. But in this case, it really is highly country specific and requires incredible attention to legal detail in terms of how can you transition back in such a way that it doesn't simply look like, okay, we're continuing a more or less cold civil war, and we can somehow get as many people on board with basically making institutions like courts genuinely independent again, because they're clearly not at the moment. Same is true for many media organizations. That is an incredibly difficult course to chart. There are ideas around. Again, I don't want to sound defeatist, but it's very difficult at this point to point to very obvious good examples of this. In cases where anti-democratic forces had been entrenched and at the same time had not really officially sort of given up on democracy.
Right.
What about the US? Last thing I'll say, so I think there are many reasons to be worried, but I've been saying so many negative things in a certain way that maybe it's also worth pointing at one advantage the United States still might have, actually compared precisely to some of the other cases that I've also alluded to. So in a sense, we've also seen a strange reversal, because for a long time, I think it's fair to say that in the United States, liberals, the left more broadly maybe, tended to see federalism as something prima facie suspect, because what was federalism for such a long time? It was basically a shield to protect segregation, to make sure that certain entirely justified initiatives by Washington wouldn't really work, and so on. And I think one of the realizations that people have had over the last couple of years is that countries which really have become autocratic very often already had a very strong centralization of power, such that if you captured certain institutions, the Constitutional Court, like the presidency, let's say, it was very easy to then basically go all the way. Whereas in the US, federalism also offered points of resistance in a certain way, that you cannot implement certain policies if certain federal states don't really play along. And I think this has led to maybe a general revaluation of the importance of decentralization in democracies. And I don't need to tell all the stories about local officials making this decision or that decision. as to whether they should really count votes this way or that way. But I think it's a broader point that also other democracies maybe have taken note of, that, you know, it's easy to kind of dismiss decentralization as part of the broader democratic package. Just as an example, so the German constitution, the basic law, has one clause known as the eternity clause, which specifies certain elements which no majority can ever change. That includes democracy, basic rights, and federalism. And for a long time, sort of people kind of tend to dismiss this and said, I mean, come on, if tomorrow Bavaria disappears, you know, as a distinct state, okay, maybe less folklore, you know, but does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? And I think now there's a realization that, yeah, maybe when the chips are down, it does matter. And if you really disperse power, it can make the difference between saving and losing democracy. So that, I think, maybe is, you know, hopefully, you know, as somebody speaks to you from sort of the literally and figuratively the darkest hours in Europe, maybe the one more uplifting and constructive thing I can say at the very end.
Okay, we have time for maybe a couple more. I think I'm going to try to put them together. I think we can do that. In what ways do you think, and you talked about the courts and Constitution, in what way do you think the U.S. Constitution is best protecting American democracy? And in what ways is it most assailable? And then I kind of follow up a little different, but get them at both. Are there democracies in the world that you think are functioning at a more highly effective level? What countries should we look to for better examples? So two kind of different questions.
Yeah. So I would highlight two aspects. One is that, as many people, of course, have been arguing, especially over the last few years, that alas, the American Constitution as it is, and then again, especially in conjunction with our electoral system and other systemic factors, basically enables a certain type of minority rule. So if, to put it bluntly, if the Republicans really had to win genuine majorities and couldn't take advantage of the fact that, you know, we have inbuilt imbalances, to put it, you know, very softly, in the Senate, the whole game would be different. But because you can basically rely on the fact that, you know, you can generate majorities, even if you get, you know, significantly fewer votes than the other side, then the incentives are very different than if you had to reach out to more people. So again, this relates back to the question about the two-party system. It's you know, at that level of abstraction, it's neither good or bad, but combined with these sort of inbuilt factors which basically allow a certain type of, you know, what also, I mean, to be fair, I mean, everybody always says the founders were worried about the tyranny of the majority. That's true, but they were also damn worried about the tyranny of a minority. I mean, they weren't oblivious to this danger. And this is where, in certain ways, we've ended up. So I think this is a kind of structural disadvantage. Of course, many people have put out proposals how one could possibly remedy that in certain ways. There are many things which I think are sort of often taken as unchangeable, which of course are not unchangeable. I mean, our election system is not unchangeable. This is an act of Congress from the 19th century. If we wanted to have multi-member districts, if we wanted to sort of change the incentives on the ground, that would be actually very easy to do. That's not a constitutional question as such. But as also said earlier, as long as those most directly affected and possibly adversely affected by these changes, it's very unlikely that these very people are going to, you know, initiate changes along these lines. Another factor, and again, this is, I think, I hesitate to even bring this up because there's so much conventional wisdom, or maybe even common sense at this point, is that there are very few other examples of countries with, you know, well-functioning democracy that people say, yeah, let's have a procedure where people go to the highest court and then they stay there until they die, or maybe occasionally leave voluntarily. I'm not aware of any other system. People say, yeah, this is a fantastic way of doing it. This, you know, is really a great way to run a court. And again, of course, there have been plenty of proposals on the table about how one could have a different system that you know, lowers the stakes in certain ways, makes us a more predictable, one might even say maybe more rational way of staffing our judiciary. But again, it's just very unlikely that this will happen in practice anytime soon. So in that sense, yes, I think there are certainly things one can learn. I think more broadly speaking, it's been, I dare say, it's been sort of salutary that also some of our colleagues in academia have become less focused on the US. And if you think of a book like How Democracies Die by our distinguished colleagues, Steve Levitsky and Dan Zieblatt, I think one of the virtues of that was simply, look, we can learn something from scholars of comparative politics, and we can look to other countries. And yes, you might still want to hold on to certain beliefs about American exceptionalism. I'm not saying that's all of a sudden prohibited or always wrong, but there's plenty you can learn from certain comparisons. And nobody's democracy, alas, nobody's democracy is guaranteed. It can fail anywhere, unfortunately. And and you might say the more we learn about January 6th, the more we are also, I think, inclined to say we already came damn close in certain ways that are only now sort of coming more properly into view.
Professor Müller, I really want to thank you for coming all the way from Hungary. I know the work that you're doing there is very important. I also know that it's 3:37 in the morning there, so I don't know whether you're just going to have a very long day. I think, isn't the election like tomorrow or sometime very soon?
It's on Sunday. It's
okay.
On April 3rd.
Okay, so yeah, you've got a busy few days. So again, I very much want to thank you. It was fascinating. You held the audience, a great addition to this series. And when you get back to the States and you can relax, come on out to Tucson. We'd love to have you. And again, thank you for the audience. Always great, difficult questions. And we plan on seeing all of you again in the next academic school year with another great lineup of speakers. So again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
All right.